Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. On this edition of Think Tank, a report from the front lines of the culture wars. We will be talking with the former anti-war radical and now an astute observer of the American cultural scene, Todd Gitlin. In his new book, he argues that multiculturalism and identity politics threaten the vitality of American society, and he blames both conservatives and liberals. A conversation with Todd Gitlin, next on Think Tank. Our guest, Todd Gitlin, was the president of the radical political organization SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, in the hothouse years of 1963 and 1964. Subsequently, he was director of the mass communications program at the University of California at Berkeley. Today, Professor Gitlin teaches at New York University. He is the author of 6 books, including the acclaimed The 60s, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. His latest book is The Twilight of Common Dreams, Why America is Racked by Culture Wars. Welcome, Todd Gitlin. Let me begin with the question I like when I'm promoting a new book. What is your book about?
My book is about how it came to pass that the right marched on Washington and took a great deal of it while the left was marching on the English department. My book is about why America is obsessed with its national identity and why so many Americans think that they have a separate identity. It's about why we have a skewed debate in which the tradition of the left, which is to proclaim the unity of humanity, is a position that is barely on the screen.
Now, you regard yourself and your history is that of a man of the left.
I do.
How would you characterize what a man of the left should believe, in addition to the fact that he can believe any damn thing he wants? But how would you, what is the generality behind the idea of being a man of the left?
Well, there's a range, and I'll just state a couple things that I hold to be self-evident. One of them is that a person of the left holds certain truths to be self-evident, and that among them are that all men and women are endowed, entitled to inalienable rights, and that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not a bad first approximation to the values of the left.
But I know some people on the right who would claim the same sentence.
Of course, and I would add, the question is whether they really have that commitment, but that's a discussion. Right. Okay. The other thing that I think a person of the left affirms is that values of solidarity, of social responsibility, of commitment to the common good are of great importance, and that among the most grievous forces that work against the realization of those values are the drastic inequalities in human society. So somebody on the left is committed to the undermining and opposition to those inequalities.
And you think the left now has taken their eye off the ball? Is that more or less the idea?
I think that many people, perhaps most on the left, or at least most who are visible, have gone down a path in which they are obsessed with what differs between them and one crowd and another. They're more obsessed with what divides them than what they have in common with the rest of humanity.
Who would these groups that engage in identity politics be, for specifics?
Many of them are so-called racial or ethnic minorities, or groups who are organized around their narrow group interest. They're not all on the left, by the way. I mean, there's also a right-wing version of identity politics, which is obsessed with being white or being male or something like that. But the left-wing version of it takes an insight. It takes an insight into the fact that certain groups have historically been kept down, and then it overplays what they think ought to be done as a result, so that you get this obsession with being marginal, this obsession with rewriting history to make it look prettier. You get an obsession with skin color and other forms of difference rather than what the society needs in common.
And you say there has been a role reversal, that the right wing has assumed the role of common politics, of commonality of American politics. I mean, it is the right wing that is saying these days we ought to judge a man by the content of his character, not the color of his skin, which is what Martin Luther King said. And the left wing that is saying, no, we ought to judge a man by the color of his skin, not by the content of his character.
It's a very odd business. I quote in the book Joseph de Maistre, the monarchist, writing in 1797 that there's no such thing as a human being. He says, I've seen Frenchmen and Russians and other members of nationalities. I've never seen this creature man. He's completely scornful of the idea that there could be such a thing as common humanity. And the view of the left then was that people are capable of reason, that all people are capable of arriving at some idea of the common interest. Well, today it's very fashionable, not only in universities, to affirm that only people of the same exact type as you, whatever exactly that means, can think about you and your needs and your history and so on. And some people on the right affirm that it's possible for everybody to aspire to the same good and to arrive at the truth. To me, this is a very curious and very important reversal and a big mistake for the left.
Why do you sound like me? I mean, you're supposed to be, that's the point I'm supposed to be making. You, as a man of the left, are supposed to be making the point that that's not so. I mean, that something is very strange.
Well, I call him as I see him. I mean,
I understand.
I don't mind disagreeing with anybody or agreeing.
Tell us the story about what happened. You begin your book with a very fascinating chapter about what happened in Oakland, California, about the school textbooks. Could you just sort of put that in a capsule for us, because it sort of sets the tone of your argument, I thought.
It's a curious thing. Over the last few years, funds for education in California have been slashed. It's been a big slash and burn operation, and fees in the universities and colleges have gone up, and classrooms are bigger, and so on. And you would think that since the left cares about the condition of public education, that this would be the issue that would be driving the passions of people on the left in California with respect to education. But in fact, the big issue that divided people and came to public attention in the early 90s in California was the objections by a group of minority spokespersons, objections to a new set of textbooks on the grounds that they were racist or insufficiently multicultural, when in fact they were the most multicultural textbooks that anybody had ever seen. They were written primarily by the same historian who's been attacked more recently by conservatives for being much too multicultural and for driving white males.
Gary
Nash of UCLA.
He was the man in charge of writing the history standards.
One of them, yes.
He was the
One
top
major
man. Yeah, he was, I think, the top man. I actually interviewed him when all that came about. Right. Those history standards were denounced by the United States Senate by a vote of 99-1 as being sort of a history of victimology in America and not telling the basic successful story of America, notwithstanding all its flaws. So, and you talk in your book, when you talk about us and them, you are putting you and Gary Nash and Ronald Reagan in the same us. And the them has now become these strident multiculturalists of the left. Is that correct?
Well, Reagan, in the sense that I take Reagan seriously as a political alliance maker. I think that Reagan in the 70s and in the 80s understood that the mission in politics is to create a political majority. I think that's a habit of mine that people on the left have lost track of. I support Gary Nash's idea of trying to find a way of telling American history which is a story of recognizable American values at work against enemies domestic and foreign. And I think they did an honorable job, not perfect, but an honorable job at trying to find a way of telling that story so that it was also a story of all the upheavals and all the voices and experiences of American society.
Why is this particular form of left-wing identity multiculturalism, why is it bad?
It's a lot easier to organize your crowd. I made a half joke before about marching on the English department, but I don't just mean it as a joke. It's a lot easier to form your community among people who look like you, to beat up on the people who are closest to you, than it is to break out of your zone and to federate with people who are unlike you and to try to develop and negotiate in a messy way, which is a democratic way, some sort of collective interest. It's much easier to do the simple thing. And I think that many people took the path of least resistance. Again, it was based on real experience that people had, that women had being mistreated in schools, and that certainly that blacks and other non-white so-called minorities had. But then this insight and experience tend to curdle. What's necessary at one moment to get attention then gets fossilized and becomes a constituency, becomes an anthem that people have to rally around, and then it develops its own momentum.
Is it just? I guess we would agree it is tactically bad for people trying to, in your case, trying to organize the left, and to find allies and Confederates to go off into the funny farm. I mean, it's certainly, that's my characterization, not yours.
Indeed.
That it is certainly tactically unwise. But is it substantively wrong also?
Yeah, I think it's philosophically shallow. Because people are different. I mean, they have different languages, experiences, customs, etc. I mean, all that is true. That's a partial truth. Much danger, much damage is done by people who inflame a partial truth into a whole truth. The partial truth is that people have different needs, that peoples have different needs, and that they deserve dignity. That if somebody wants to have the capacity to speak a certain language, fine. I don't have any objection if the ambulance drivers also speak Chinese so they can help people in Chinatown. But at the same time, what's being downplayed is the understanding that we're not, after all, of different species. There is one race. We're not talking about Martians and Venusians here. We're talking about human beings, and human beings have common obligations and common experiences. And even the people who clamor about how different they are tend to do it in the same language and tend to try to convince other people that they're right. In other words, there's a kind of hypocrisy here in this hysteria about difference. Because after all, people are making arguments and trying to convince each other, right? So they actually are in a common conversation that they should acknowledge as such.
When and why did the conservatives come to take on the mantle of the defenders of the common culture?
It's a tragedy of the late 60s, and I say it's a tragedy rather than a crime because it's a case of something that was magnificent, namely the civil rights movement, reaching a point at which a significant number of its partisans felt that they had to accentuate what differentiated blacks from the rest of America. Now, that need not have led to disaster had it not been, in my view, for the Vietnam War, which distracted Johnson from the great work of the Great Society, and the collapse of what you could call a sort of ecumenical liberalism, which was sometimes represented by Johnson or could have been represented by Bobby Kennedy. That collapse and the wars between liberals and radicals helped destroy both of them as political forces.
And at that time you were a radical, not a liberal.
Correct. Correct.
And now you are a liberal, not a radical?
I don't know what it means to be a radical today.
I mean, they're your terms.
I don't know. I mean, my views about the control of capital, I guess, are radical. I believe that it's a serious problem for governments to figure, any governments, by the way, to figure out how you can benefit a whole population when you have this, the most powerful force in the world is just free to dash about and wreak havoc. I think that you need radical measures to control those. I'm a radical in that sense. To me, that's the essence of the radical tradition. It's a question of whether the most powerful force in the world is free to simply gallivant about being powerful without being publicly
The most
harnessed.
powerful force being the force of capital.
Yes. Yeah. To me, that's the differentiation point. If you believe that capital has too much power, and you believe that there need to be democratic controls on that power, then you're a radical in my book. Being radical has nothing to do with how multicultural you are, or how, or anything like that. Being radical has nothing to do with whether you support or oppose affirmative action. To me, a lot of the issues that are being debated today are shallow and relatively inconsequential issues. Again, it's a tragedy that an issue like affirmative action, where not that much is either gained or lost by anybody, but it's symbolically inflamed. You know, affirmative action, when it was first articulated by Johnson and other people in the left wing of the Democratic Party in the late 60s, was meant to be one reform among a whole package of reforms, which would, in ensemble, create jobs, would raise the floor, would raise guaranteed income, etc. When you eliminate all those other things, which we've been doing in recent years because we don't like the government, and we don't like a lot of programs, welfare and public housing and so on, and we don't even have a goal anymore of full employment. When you do away with all those things, and you have a more or less continuous ghettoized population that's tearing itself to ribbons, and you simply rely on affirmative action to do the work of compensating for the awful history of race in America, then what do you get? You get a war, a zero-sum game between the whites who are least prosperous, fighting with other people who are not prosperous over who gets to be a fireman or who gets into a college. And, you know, win or lose, what you have here is this tremendous squabble over very scarce resources among people who can ill afford to be confronting each other in this way.
Are you an angry white male?
Yeah, but I'm not angry at the same people a lot of other white males are. I don't much like the category.
I mean, they're angry at the left also, and you're angry at the
but not for the same reason.
You're angry at the left. No, they are angry at this multicultural silliness and this zero-sum mentality and this kind of trashing America, and you're angry at the same thing. So why do you call yourself a leftist?
Well, I'm not an angry...
We were talking before the show. In 5 years, you're going to be where I am. You're going to be in the neoconservative center.
You know, the things have moved so far to the right that the neoconservative center is, you know, is
how could things have moved to the right if conservatives now say that we ought to be paying attention to the content of their character, adopting? There's a big myth in American politics that things have moved to the right. I mean, what has happened is, among other things, that conservatives have moved leftward toward the center on a lot of issues, including race and internationalism and a whole lot of things.
Let me answer your question first, before we lose it, about why the angry white men are wrong. They're right to observe that their position, many of them, is tenuous. Their jobs are tenuous. Their sense of mastery is, you know, undermined. A lot of these guys are recoiling against feminism. And anytime you have a great social upheaval, as you had in the 60s, you can have a recoil. So one has to sympathize with the people who are in recoil, because for the most part, they're not people who had easy lives. For the most part, they're people whose lives were difficult. And now they're feeling their horizons have shrunk, that the future doesn't look very good. And in the meantime, there's somebody who has somewhat less than they do, who's beating up on them and telling them that they're the enemy, and they say the hell with it, you know? They don't want to be demonized, and I sympathize. I don't think they should be demonized.
Is it fair to say that some on the left today, if not un-American, are anti-American?
First of all, I don't think there really is a left. You know, if a left believes in commonality, then I don't think there quite is one. But among the people who are tabbed as the left today, I think there are people who are insufficiently appreciative of certain of the virtues of American dreams, including the virtue of of integration, the virtue of diversity, a word that's much used but insufficiently valued. I think there are people who are obsessed by their difference from others and by their rancor and about victimization. I think that's all a big mistake. You know, Americans are founded on the idea that, you know, somewhere out there is them, they, who are doing it to us, you know. We're the little guys, the big guys took over, it's the king, it's the Kaiser, it's somebody else. You know, that's what's unified us for a large part of our history, that, you know, that we're victims. We don't want to be, but... you know, during much of this time, Americans feel like victims of circumstance. You know, I think paradoxically, it's because Americans think that people should be totally free. Don't tread on me, live free or die, and so on. That when things go wrong, we thrash around, you know, looking for malevolent forces who are conspiring against us. Because we should be wondering, we should all be free and happy and kicking with delight. And
do you believe that that is one of the great glories of American civilization, the amount of human liberty and freedom?
Of course, but you pay a price for it, which is that when people aren't free, when people feel endangered or feel crowded or et cetera, they start looking for them.
Well, why did they go down this road? I mean, why did they go this peculiar definition of multiculturalism? I mean, we are a multicultural society. I have no particular argument about that. You can get that out of the census reports. But why did they put this special spin on it?
A whole lot of bad moves took place in the late 60s. And while I wouldn't want to say this was the only reason, I really do think that the Vietnam War was shattering to the judgment and the equanimity of many people on the left. I think that it led them to an overwrought rejection of the liberal tradition, both the New Deal version of the liberal tradition and the tolerant version of the liberal tradition. It placed a premium on a kind of blind rage. The revolutionary style, which started heating up in the late 60s, which was delusional. There was no revolutionary situation, and revolutions are not picnics.
Did you know that at the time?
Yeah.
There was no revolution?
Oh, yeah. But, you know, it was very hard to be clear about that, and there were reasons why everything else seemed to be failing. So you had a lot of smart people acting less smart than they knew how to be.
Here's your book, The Twilight of Common Dreams. I would really recommend it to viewers. It's a very thoughtful examination of the current situation in America. What are your solutions?
I don't have my program to unfurl. My solution is a mentality. And the mentality is to look for the framing of public issues in such a way as to create a sense of the common human bond rather than the sense of warring tribes. I think if one's commitment is to that principle, to that mentality, then a lot of disputes will remain. A lot of arguments are legitimate about this policy or that policy, but the philosophical underpinning would be in place, and the philosophical underpinning would be a commitment to the common humanity.
Given this internecine cannibalism that's going on the left, is there a future for the left?
This depends on whether the left decides that it wants to be a political force that federates people. If the left is convicted, has the conviction that it's that it's nothing more than the sum of a lot of little shards, then that's what it's going to be, a heap, and it's not going to be on the charts.
What's your guess?
I'm neither. Henry Kissinger said one thing I like when he was asked at one point during the peace talks whether he was optimistic or pessimistic. He said, "I'm mystic."
Thank you very much for joining us, Todd.
Thank you, Ben.
And thank you. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.